Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading On Politics by Alan Ryan, a book detailing the history of Western political theory. This time we're looking at Thomas Aquinas and how he synthesized the pagan philosophers into the Christian world. An interesting chapter. Pretty long, but I liked it.
Why do you think it's long? It's 30 pages.
It was like 2 pages longer than the average, I think.
I thought the last two were like 40-something pages.
Were they? No, they were still in the 30s, I think.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
You seem subdued today. You tired?
I'm a little tired.
Yeah? You were out late last night? What time did you get home?
It was like 12:40 or something, so it wasn't too late. Yeah.
I was already asleep.
Yes.
So what did you think of the chapter?
I liked it. I thought it was very good.
You like every chapter.
I do like every chapter.
Actually, what was the one chapter of one book you didn't like?
I think there was one in Joseph Campbell that I was just like, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think all the others, I think every other chapter that we've read, I've liked.
So it shouldn't be a surprise to me that you like every one of them.
No, probably not.
Well, it's well written. He's a good author, and I'll have a couple of comments as we go.
Yes.
But Aquinas is always an interesting read and discussion for a couple Catholic dudes.
Talk about the podcast real quick. We got 99 downloads this morning.
What do you mean, just this morning?
Just today, yes. That does not happen usually.
So I guess there's one person who could have downloaded the whole season.
Probably.
I suspect it may be a friend of mine.
Really?
Yeah, who used to live 2 doors down.
Oh.
I don't necessarily want to, out this person. But I was talking to him last night. He's been listening to our first season.
Oh.
And I'm like, oh, those were pretty rough, if I remember, because we were kind of working through how we're going to do this. And he said, yeah, one episode, I think it was like an episode that we recorded on the computer speaker by mistake or something. So he said he had to turn up the whole volume and all that stuff. But
yeah.
He says he's a fan.
Oh, well, there we go.
Listen to like 5 or 6 of them.
Oh, really?
That's a commitment.
That is, yeah. These are long episodes to listen to us.
So we have a super fan.
Apparently. That makes 2.
Yes.
Two listeners. You can't say listener anymore. We know there's 2.
I'm still going to do it because they probably take turns. They're not listening.
That's to say, no, never.
I know this is a live broadcast, but they probably are listening to it after it's been
this is not
recorded.
This is not a live broadcast. We're not broadcasting anyway. It's recording.
Oh,
no.
Shoot. All right. Well, then why do we have the 7-second delay?
All right, let's get into Aquinas. Alan Ryan kind of starts this chapter off by talking about the revival of philosophy itself. He says Aquinas' situation was the reverse of Augustine's. At this time during Aquinas' life, Europe was Christian. It had recovered from the chaos of the fall of the Roman Empire, and the unity was spiritual, not political. And there was a great intellectual unity in Latin. And so Aquinas attempted to integrate the insights of pagan philosophy into this environment. But this posed some difficulties because the church authorities were anxious or even hostile to the rediscovery of Aristotle, and his writings were condemned several times. And Aquinas' thoughts on politics are relatively few. They often read like diluted Aristotle. His main thing was philosophy rather than politics. But he believed... Diluted
meaning like watered down, or diluted like crazy?
Diluted like watered down, not diluted like crazy. He's not crazy Aristotle. But he did believe that we are fallen creatures, but thinks that the state shelters forms of social life that are relatively good, but we cannot perfect ourselves within the political community, but we could still, bring about, virtuous, happy, and fruitful lives. So it's not just like a bad thing. It's not an unfortunate thing that we have the state. It can be a good thing. We can use it for good purposes, which is kind of different from what Augustine said.
Have you come up with your band name yet? Because
we have not.
I'm thinking diluted Aristotle.
Diluted Aristotle,
yes,
yeah,
would be, or crazy Aristotle.
Crazy Aristotle, yeah. That would be a name.
Yeah,
I can say that.
I like diluted, but yes, I guess we'll talk a little bit more in detail about his theories of like how a political setup, or what am I looking for? The word I'm looking for, like a political system, will encourage or can encourage more moral behavior.
Yes.
So I'll hold some thoughts on that.
He also makes a note that Aquinas was not a very stylish writer. He wrote an incredible amount, very rapidly, and he sometimes dictated up to 5 scribes at a time. But he wrote in this medieval scholastic style, which was that, his views were presented as answers to questions, right, and then there were sub-questions that he answered, and so it was very much like not like a novel type of writing. It was very much an academic style. So he says, Aquinas can be hard to get into. I mean, because he wrote so incredibly much, and because what he wrote is not very, easy to read, I suppose.
Yeah, and it didn't dawn on me that Aquinas wasn't doing the writing himself, that he had scribes.
Yeah.
He's basically dictating. And that gives me hope that maybe I could be an author. I really don't like typing it all out, but I can shoot off my mouth and tell somebody to take it down. So I'm thinking maybe I'll write a book that way.
You could.
I'll hire a typist. I will call him or her my scribe.
Your scribe? Yes, that's lovely.
I'll make that person put a feather or a quill in their hat or something. Like dress like an old scribe.
That is ridiculous.
And write with an inkwell.
So it'd be slower than writing it yourself, is what you're saying. You were just hindering your progress. It'd be faster if you typed it.
But you have to set up an atmosphere of creativity, and that would be my.
Are you gonna be in a dimly lit room with candles and
candles?
Just candles. All right.
Maybe if it's cold, a fire, and a dog sleeping by the fire.
All right.
No cats.
Moving on to Aquinas' life and times. He was born in either 1224 or 1225 and died in 1274. His family was aristocrats from Aquino, and he was sent as a child to the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino in 1238, and then later went to the newly formed University of Naples, where he discovered the Dominican order in 1244. And he wanted to join the order despite his family's wishes, and after a year, they finally allowed him to go to the University of Paris, where he studied under the German theologian Albertus Magnus. There's kind of a funny passage in here, reading from the book. Aquinas was a substantial young man. In later life, the table at which he sat was scooped out to accommodate his girth, and was jokingly called the ox by his colleagues. They saw he was extraordinarily intelligent, and Albertus observed that the bellowing of that ox will be heard throughout the world, though he could have hardly foreseen that Thomism would eventually become the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. So, very important figure.
Also, one of the thoughts I had reading this, about his writing surviving, and there's a reference in here that his notes on Albertus's lectures survived, and I thought, anybody, to our listener who may be any listener, maybe like a college professor or a teacher, could you think they would be happy that the only version of whatever they were teaching was in one of their students' notes?
Yeah.
What if they got that wrong? It's just kind of interesting to me that survives, and maybe
it's just weird to think about. Like in 1,000 years from now, somebody might find my notebook on Dr. Richter's class on Intro to Linguistics, and it's like that's crazy.
Right. It's much more likely they'll have this stupid recording. Somehow, we have to figure out a way to put it on some sort of disc and launch it into space so that
the aliens
can
receive, and that's how they will
wisdom.
And that's the only evidence that humans will have ever existed, is us two talking.
What was the? There was a movie. It was in the 80s that was premised on Martians, having received the television signals from early TV and thinking that's what America was.
I don't know that.
And they come, or not America, the world was. I'll have to look that up, but it was a really goofy movie.
Yes. Going back to Aquinas, he received his licentum docendi, or his license to teach, in 1256, and he began lecturing and began the first of his two summae, the Summa contra Gentiles, which was intended for missionaries for use in converting Muslims and Jews. And in 1265, he opened a studium generale in Rome and wrote De Regimine Principum and began the Summa Theologiae. And at this time, he was working with William of Moerbeek, who had begun to translate Aristotle out of the original Greek. And he was one of the first to do so because they had been operating on this point of translations, usually from Latin and then from Arabic from the Greek. So a couple steps removed from the original.
And those languages are so different. I would think you'd lose something.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. He then returned to Naples in 1272, during which he suffered a collapse in health in 1273, which led him to declare that he could write no more. And he famously said, all that I have written seems like straw to me. So he wrote all these books, and then at the end of his life, he's like, well, was it really worth it? Yeah. It doesn't seem like much at all. But then on the way to the Council of Lyons in 1274, he suffered an accident that led to his death. He was canonized in 1323, but Thomism didn't become the official Catholic philosophy until the Reformation. And then he makes an interesting point about the Dominicans. They were primarily a learned order, the intellectual arm of the church militant, and they proselytized on behalf of the faith, especially to preach to crusaders. And when they were not engaged in religious duties, they were told to study, and they were notable linguists, as they preached in Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and basically any language that they needed when they went out proselytizing, which is interesting.
Yes. This guy died approximately 50 years of age, and he had such a profound impact on the world and world history. I am 52, and I've done nothing. I've done absolutely nothing.
You have this podcast. There you go.
And he didn't think it was worth that much either, I guess. So maybe I do have hope. Maybe the things that I have been doing, which is really nothing, will change the world forever.
Maybe somewhere out there, your notes in a notebook from college have survived, and they're being held on by somebody, and they'll be rediscovered in 500 years to become the official philosophy of a new nation.
God, wouldn't that be great?
That'd be. I thought you were going to say, wouldn't that be crazy? I was not expecting great.
Except for I didn't really take notes. I doodled a lot. I was not my notes would be. I used to, when I told you this, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this in a podcast, I used to leave notes to myself.
Yes.
Yeah, because I believed that I was three people.
Wait, you have no what? You haven't told me that part.
Yeah. So there's Mark past, there's Mark present, Mark future.
Mark future. Okay.
And I have a relatively poor memory. And so I would, Mark present would write a note, like, because I'm dealing with paper notebooks, which I don't know that people use, little spiral notebooks. And I go like 50 pages, 30 pages in the forward, and I'd write a note to myself. Hey, how you doing, Mark? Future Mark, and tell him what I was doing that day, and then I'd forget. And then I turn the page, a couple weeks later in the notebook, and I'm like, oh, thanks, Mark Past. That's a nice little note. It's very encouraging.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing.
So that's what I if anybody finds my notebooks, that's what's going to be in posterity.
Yes, it's going to be some man talking to himself in like the 80s. Be of no use to anybody. Okay. True. Going back to Aquinas, Alan Ryan then talks about the intellectual life in 13th century Europe and kind of the climate at that time. And this is when you start to see the universities kind of appear, and they were initially founded by kings who needed lawyers. They first focused on the study of Roman law, and at this time the church had its own system of canon law and lawyers.
So the church still has canon law.
Yes.
But anyway, go ahead.
Yes. But at the time it was an important distinction between,
the canon, because the church administered so much of the secular world is very much more important than it is now. Now it's just to make sure that you can't punish, pedophile priests.
Yes, exactly. But then universities eventually grew to include law, medicine, theology, mathematics, and what they called natural philosophy, which was really physics and astronomy kind of combined. And then a pattern emerged of students being admitted to higher studies after they had attained the proficiency at the bachelor level. And so that's kind of how we start to see, the system that we still have today with the bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctorates and stuff like that. So you first had to prove proficiency at a lower level before, going on to get the education that will let you get your licendi locentum docendi.
Yeah, your teaching certificate.
Yes. Teaching. Yes, exactly. I was trying to find the right Latin, but yeah, that's what it is.
I do like that he mentions that it's called the Dark Ages, but he even calls it a libel for most of Europe because there's a lot of studying and deep thoughts during this period of time that I think is underappreciated.
True.
Yeah.
True. And theology,
probably a lot more than what's going on now. It seems like universities, with some exceptions, it's like it's too all-encompassing. Like everybody's going to the university and nobody even knows why. Very few people know why.
Yeah, I've been talking about that with some people. I've had some weird experiences at college recently with just like people who can't seem to put any effort in. Like they just don't know how, and it's strange.
Don't know how or won't do it.
I don't know, but it's like this thing. I'm in the sociolinguistics class, and essentially the whole point of the class. It's a stupid class. I hate the class. But it's really not that hard. But the point is we're going to be making like an experiment throughout the semester. And so we've had, a research question due like a month and a half ago at this point. And then we had to put together an annotated bibliography, find some sources about it, and then put together a literature review. and that was due like last week or a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I think I was one of 3 people in the entire class who had any sort of literature review completed.
Huh.
And like nobody had done it. They're like, well, I didn't understand what you meant on this, so I just didn't know what to do, so I didn't really start.
Don't they have like office hours?
Oh yeah, and everything's detailed in the syllabus and stuff like that. And I mean, granted, our syllabus is a little confusing, but I mean, even still, do something,
right?
Rather than do nothing,
right?
It's just very strange. It's very strange.
Yeah.
But it's like, it wasn't even due for a grade that day. It was just for like a peer review session where we'd sit with somebody else and we'd go over what we had.
Well, that I understand because I hated peer review.
Yes.
I refused to participate with peer review if I could. If it wasn't due for a grade, I wouldn't have done it by that date. I would just do it when it's due.
Yeah.
And to hell with peer review, because you look around that room at your peers. Do you think they're really going to give you any positive
No.
input on how to improve your paper?
No.
The answer is no, correctly. And so I'm in the defense of the people doing nothing. What a stupid...
But the thing, they weren't just doing nothing with the literature review.
Yeah.
Most of them had not even done anything or had half of like the annotated bibliography done, which was due weeks ago.
Oh, it was due. Was it to be graded?
Yes,
weeks
to
ago?
be graded weeks ago.
Oh,
and I think like the actual literature review draft was due, I guess, this past Wednesday, and I don't think many people even got that done.
So I assume they're going to flunk. I mean, how does she run that class? How are they still in the class if they haven't done that yet?
I don't know.
Don't you think you as a professor, you'd say, you're not doing any of the work, and so maybe you want to drop?
Well, I think
I grade you.
I think part of it is kind of on her too, because her whole attitude towards the whole thing, like even with like the research question stuff, which we should have had planned out a long time ago, because that's foundation. It's like it's okay if you don't really have a specific idea, if you have a general topic, things like that. And then again with the annotated bibliography, it's like it's okay if you don't have anything perfectly organized. And I think that's kind of just led to everybody like either it's been strange. It's a strange class.
To have an effective leader.
Yes.
Who has defined what it is to have success. Otherwise, nobody knows what the hell to do.
Yes.
$10 says they all get B's.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
You'll get an A.
Yeah.
Because as Sam describes you, you're a try-hard.
That is accurate.
Yeah. So when Sam gets to this episode, he will appreciate it.
I don't think Sam listens. I really don't think he does. I think he's very opposed to listening.
All right, back to where we were.
Yes.
I got a sidetracked about universities in modern day. We were talking about. We're still talking. He almost does. I like reading it, but he really goes into a lot of depth as to the history and a description of the era in which these philosophers are there. The book could be half as long without going into all that detail. But I enjoy it.
Yeah, because he says theology was the queen of the sciences at the time, and authorities kind of feared the effect of pagan thought on undisciplined young minds. But however, he says the rise of the philosophical approach to faith was unstoppable, as the church fathers themselves employed a lot of Greek philosophy. So you can't really, keep Greek philosophy out of it entirely if it's, founded on Greek philosophy.
Right.
But he says the empirical scientific aspect of Greek thought was initially lost, but the more mystical writings were kept in circulation by Latin translations and encyclopedic works. So they had like bits and pieces of Plato, but mostly like his metaphysical stuff. And then they had various authors kind of describing like large overviews of Greek thought.
Well, when there's a discussion of these people like screaming heretic and having people burned to the stake, do you make the same connection I do to modern day leftists and the Twitter mobs and that kind of stuff? Because I'm reading this and I'm like, I wish the present day people would have read some history of the Catholic Church and the burning of heretics, and they'd appreciate that they're on the wrong side on this thing. But it's fascinating that it's like a human tendency to try to banish wrong think. Yeah, that ideas are dangerous to society and need to be forcibly silenced. And that's really what we're talking about in modern world. But anyway.
Yes. And then Aristotle was especially prominent, although he was somewhat Platonized, as Alan Ryan calls it. And he made his way into universities in the 12th century from Arabic translations from the Greek. And then when it came time to translate actual things from the Greek, Aquinas insisted on working on those translations himself because Aristotle was very, very important to him. Yeah. Which is interesting. We then get into this discussion of reason versus revelation and kind of the difference between faith and philosophy. And he makes the point that Aristotle's philosophy was definitely philosophy, but he says Christianity wasn't really philosophy, especially at the time. It was really a historical, particularistic creed that rests on revelation. And Aquinas set out to reconcile Aristotle's reason-based metaphysics with Christian faith. And so a nuanced view was needed for this. Too much reliance on faith would lead to irrationalism, and too much reliance on reason would lead to skepticism. But he says that there's definitely a place for reason within faith. He says reason is the light of nature, but natural reason can only take us so far. He says grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. It cannot uncover everything, but it is a God-given instrument to be employed effectively within its own limits.
You know what I really liked about how he describes this tension between the authority of the king and the authority of the church, and then reason as it applies to your philosophical beliefs and your religious beliefs. There's this one phrase here on 231. He says, "To a rational inquirer, unaided by revelation, it was not obvious why God had created the world at all." And I just like how he has kind of the unaided by revelation. You know, I like how he gives respect to people that believe, through their faith, that God created the world and that they can come to a conclusion based on their faith. And he certainly has a certain amount of respect for differing views and for the religious views throughout this section. I just appreciated that, because he doesn't just say to a rational inquirer, it is not obvious, why God created Earth. He puts it in a context that's not insulting to people who are religious.
It kind of gives me the impression, I don't know much about Alan Ryan himself, but it gives me the impression that he is at least religious in some fashion. I don't know if he's Christian or not, but I feel like he definitely has respect
for it. So he could be an atheist for all I know, but there are different flavors of atheists. There's atheists that are hostile to the concept of God and to religious people, and other people that are atheists because they think that's the appropriate response. But they have, like Christopher Hitchens, who I really appreciated. He's the one that led me down the path of hating Mother Teresa. He was an author and a left-winger, but he got cancer at the end of his life. And it was terminal, of course, because it was at the end of his life. But he had a lot of people, because he was a noted atheist, and he would debate people who were Christians. And he would often say in interviews how much he appreciated that people who are Christian or of faith, Muslim or whatever, that said they'd pray for him, and they were praying for him and for him to recover, and he appreciated that, even though he thought it was nonsense. But it was the nice thought that it was a kind thing for them to do based upon their beliefs. So those kind of atheists I have a tremendous amount of respect for, because they have respect for people who disagree with them. They're not just insulting with it. You believe in nonsense, and they just insult people. Anyway, so I'm sorry to go on that aside, but I really appreciate this author, because he gives a fair accounting for all these different, ideas and really forces that are in play. Anyway.
He says, we can have some but not an adequate idea of matters that faith dealt with. Reason can lead us to acknowledge the need for faith and make it plausible that what we believe on faith is true, but full revelation must await our vision of God in the afterlife. He goes on to say that for Aquinas, ethics and politics are doubly subordinate. The chief topic that Aquinas was concerned with was the nature of God, the nature of creation, and the relation of all creations to each other and to God. He says we should aim only at as much certainty as the subject allows. Ethics and politics are realms of prudence and good sense, not certainty. So we can never really get it, 100% accurate is what he says.
But it's useful to use your reason and your common sense in studying those areas.
Yes.
You just know you're not going to have an absolute known answer 100%. It's going to be based upon prudence, and it's just not going to be known. Like 2 + 2 = 4.
Yes. He goes on to say that Aquinas made no work directly devoted to politics. De Regimine Principum would have been such a work, but it was devoted to the king of Cyprus, who died towards the beginning of the actual writing. I think he said he got to like halfway through chapter 2 of this book. And so Aquinas left it unfinished. And so everything of interest to politics comes from the little bits of De Regimine Principum and the two Summae, and a letter to the Duchess of Brabant on how heavily she could tax Jewish subjects. So a very specific area of politics. But that's about as close as we get to really political thought.
Right.
And then bits and pieces from the two Summae.
Are you going to go into details about the political situation between the popes and stuff, or?
I was going to, but now that I'm looking at it, I don't know if I really need to. I mean, there's a couple important points. There was just a big conflict, he says at the time, between the papacy and the empire during Aquinas' life, and there was a major territorial and financial conflict between Pope Innocent IV and Emperor Frederick II. And
Frederick II was some sort of distant cousin of Aquinas, which I thought was interesting.
Yes, that was interesting. But essentially, the whole issue was that Frederick wanted to establish a secular nation that incorporated the papal states in much of central Italy, and of course, the Pope did not want that to happen.
Right.
So there was a thing with the Pope before him, Pope Innocent III, that essentially had Frederick agree to what did he have him agree to? That he pay homage to the Pope and renounce the kingdom of Sicily if he was ever elected Empire of the Roman Empire. And he also got Frederick to promise to go through a crusade at some point, which would effectively distract him from conquering Italy and the affairs of Italy. So he's pretty much stopped from accomplishing his task, and he died, I believe, in 1250 with this kingdom never being accomplished because of these roadblocks that were put in place.
Right, but it was an important philosophical and religious conflict. Okay, who's in charge?
Yeah.
Who's in charge of what, and who's the ultimate authority? And that, that we have a resolution of that in some manner today, but they certainly didn't at the time. So it would take up a lot of the political theorizing. Okay, who's really the king of all things on the earth?
There was an important kind of side note in here that I want to mention, in that there were these ideas of somewhat republican structures in natural law coming up, and they were unattractive to both the popes and the kings. He says, these ascending theories of authority were a bad basis for absolutism, and he kind of defines natural law here as it sets the standards of communal justice. A populace invests in elite with authority to make the laws in concordance with natural law, and the government should suit the people under it and unite justice with the pursuit of common good. So kind of the beginnings of, government from the people and for the people, essentially, which is an important thing happening at the time.
Right.
Then we get into Aquinas' political theory itself, and he was very concerned with the question of how divine and natural law are related. So this led to the question of what forms of political authority men can legitimately institute, and whether any are more natural than others. As he says, and then also what difference the truth of Christianity makes to the conduct of politics, how a Christian should behave in a state, how a Christian ruler should behave. So the questions that we're seeing that Augustine covered as well a couple hundred years before this.
Right.
He says, Aquinas had to diffuse the tension between a Christian view that separated social arrangements of post-fall mankind from those if we had never fallen, and the pagan view that the social and political world are continuous with the natural world. So essentially the idea that our social arrangements now are somewhat unnatural, the natural state of humanity pre-fall, and that's very different from the pagan view that the social arrangements are very natural and the kind of intended goal of humanity.
Right. That we are not in a natural state because of our, the fall, Adam and all that stuff, and our sophistication. That we've been better off just being more like, I guess, innocent animals.
Yes. And he says that there's really two things that are very hard to reconcile from each side to the other. He says one of those is the dramatic fall from grace, which has no classical counterpart, and then the Stoic doctrine of apatheia, or detachment from desire, which has really no place in Christianity, because Christians believe that the grace of God is the only solution. But apatheia is kind of this idea of, free yourself from your own thoughts and that sort of stuff. And that's how you move away from sin and evil acts and that sort of thing. And that's not what Christians believe. So it's very hard to combine those two things with the other in Aquinas' synthesis here.
Correct. Right. Yeah. The idea that you would not have those emotional and those passions were foreign to him, I would think. Right?
Yes. It goes on to say that Christianity drew sharp distinctions between natural equality and conventional inequality, so very different from Aristotle here. Aquinas, of course, does not believe that slaves are slaves by nature, just that they happen to be slaves now by the course of things, but there's nothing inherent about them that makes them slaves.
Right.
But he took over Aristotle's naturalism in regard to earthly affairs. He says, within proper limits, observation and reflection can tell us almost all we need to know about the conduct of everyday life. So essentially just looking at the systems around us and seeing, okay, they evolved this way because it's somewhat natural for them to do so in the given state that we're in.
Right, and that everything has been created for some particular purpose or goal, I guess you could say. Like there's an example about apples being existing to
apple
tree is existing to. Oh, sorry to steal your thunder,
but it's
a conversation. I can say
I know,
stuff too.
but I have this even underlined in my book.
All right, do you want to read it? Go ahead and read it.
Yes, because this is the teleology idea that everything exists for a purpose, like you were saying.
Yeah, you just said it.
Yes, well, you didn't say teleology. I was making sure to get the term in there.
Teleology.
Yes, he says apples, for example, exist to provide food of a certain sort, but they are also intended to grow to a proper roundness and redness in the process. We describe plants as flourishing, and thus show that we understand them as having a destiny as good specimens of their kind. So it's not just the end goal, but it's also what it is throughout the process of achieving that end goal.
Right. What is its purpose?
What is its purpose?
As it goes forward.
Exactly. So he agreed with Aristotle that the polity exists so that we can live as good a life as possible on Earth.
I think that's missing from today. I think that's something that we're going to see more of in the year. It used to be very common in American history to focus on the government improving not only just specific results for society, but improving people's morality and their good behavior.
Yeah.
And we don't really see that as the motivating factor. And I think that's what's really missing with the criminal justice reform movement, is that they're missing that a lot of what the state does is to not only to punish and all that stuff, but to encourage good behavior.
Well, I feel like it's almost overemphasized and underemphasized in a way, because I feel like now the emphasis is on rehabilitation and stuff like that, and that we need to get them back, to a healthy state and stuff like that. So I feel like some of that is there, but it's not
that's
about...
different.
You think so?
That's treating crimes as illness.
As illness, yeah.
In my view, that you're correct that is a view that is a primary purpose, and I've talked about that before. And I personally don't view the criminal justice system as social work.
Yeah.
We have the focus now that the criminal justice system is set up for the benefit of the criminal,
Yeah.
and instead of bringing justice to the criminal, whatever shape that is. But I'm talking more generally about all laws.
Yeah.
I mentioned the criminal justice side of it, but we don't seem to have an idea of, well, we have this government set up to make us better people, to help us be better people in a better society. You see that over moralizing about some stuff like global warming. That'll make us better people if we somehow reduce global warming. But
well, I think you also see that with LGBT stuff in the government too.
True. Yeah.
I think those are pretty much the two major examples. They wouldn't call it morality. They say, well, it's just common sense. It's just human. Blah 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 blah. But I think it's very much a morality system, especially with those two issues.
Well, yes and no, but because the policies they prescribe on the global warming side, they're saying it's morally repugnant not to support these policies to reduce carbon, but they don't have a moral basis for the reduction of carbon. That makes sense?
Yeah.
It's a scientific goal, an amoral goal, but they couch all of it in moral language.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that the policy itself, the policy goal itself, should be in part to improve people. Some laws are just ministerial, but we have lost that. Okay, what's our policy with regard to homeless? And it's dealing with the symptoms, but it's not dealing with really what we're trying to do is improve these people, not just their life, but improve them.
Yeah,
and that is lost because that assumes that there's something wrong with them.
Well, yeah, that's what I've seen all over the place, especially the homeless issue. You're not supposed to call them homeless people; they are people experiencing homeless. And it's experiencing homelessness, I guess I should say, not experiencing homeless. But it's this idea that there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. It's there is something wrong with that. We should be working to make sure that these people have a home and some place to stay. And there's it just happens to people, and it's okay if they're in that state. And it's no, we should be doing everything we can to get them out of that state, not doing stuff that keeps them there.
Yeah, so they're confusing the statement is hate the sin, not the sinner, which we would agree with. But they don't acknowledge that this person is making mistakes, whether they're sins or whether they're bad. They're making decisions that make them worse people.
Yeah.
Because they're destroying the local environment in a lot of cases, And of course, they're, generally you're talking about the homeless population is generally drug abusers and with mental illness, or either or both. But my point is that there's something that needs to be done by the government, not just to address the temporary problem with them being on the street, but also the more permanent problem that they are not. They need to improve themselves.
They're not encouraged enough to complete actions that would bring themselves out of that state.
Correct. Right. And quite frankly, a lot of it is a moral failing. And we don't want to say that. We don't want to say it's a moral failing because it's, I know drug addicts, your free will is reduced. I think there really is a strong force being exhibited against you mentally, psychologically, and physically, but it doesn't completely eliminate your free will, except for in some very extreme situations, brief situations. At some point, you do have a choice in there to either seek help or do things differently.
It's an explanation, not an excuse, I would say. It's part of the reason why, but it doesn't excuse your actions.
Right, and so I think, it used to be, I'm talking about like 50 years from in the past, it was almost exclusively couched in morality. Yeah. These people are doing bad things, and they're acting in a bad way, and they are bad people. So it was almost a little bit more of almost going too far on the other side, because they're not necessarily bad people, but they're certainly making bad decisions, and we need to use the government to help encourage them to act in a just manner, in an appropriate manner. We don't have that. We have this moralizing about things that are not moral issues. Yeah. Because especially like the global warming is just so obvious, because it's just a specific scientific goal that is neither moral or immoral. Yeah. What is moral about whether the temperature goes up a degree? There's nothing about that. And so then the question is, number one is, does that problem exist? Number two, is there something we can do about it? And number three, what is it that we want to do about it? It's a public policy decision. It has nothing to do with morality. I mean, nothing to do with morality, except for if somebody's out there saying, oh, we're all going to die and I want us all to die, and so I'm going to pump all this stuff, this carbon in the atmosphere, which nobody is doing. Yeah. So it's strange. And I think this chapter is very important because I think that's where we're going. We're going to go the forces are going to push back in this direction, and then in the near future in the United States, there's going to be a lot more moralizing about people's choices in a way that we haven't done for a couple decades. Anyway.
Yes. Back to the book, kind of going along with what you're saying, Aquinas did believe that a coercive state may be necessitated by sin. So essentially that, we do have coercive laws because we are sinful, but a well-ordered state is more than a regrettable necessity. Like it's a good thing that the state exists in some circumstances.
Right. A good, just state has a good, purposeful reason to exist.
Yeah, he says that he almost agrees with the idea that the polis is the highest form of human association, but he places, a slightly higher community. He says the highest community is the community of the Christian faithful. Right. But at the same time, we are here to lead good lives, and the individual needs others with whom to live the good life in common. And so therefore, a political system is required to secure relationships and make the good life possible. Right. And so in De Regimine, he argues that monarchy is the best form of government, but he kind of puts it in a very impersonal way. He says kingship is not personal. One man embodies the unity of common good and the coherence of its pursuit more effectively than the multitude or a numerous body.
Right. So he's not saying that you have a divine right to be a king because you're the king.
It's just you are more effective in securing the common good
on behalf of everybody else. So it is kind of an explanation of a power derived from the people in a way, because you have to be a just king in order to be a legitimate king, and you're just happen to be in the position to have the responsibility of being a king.
And he does agree with Aristotle that the politeia is the best practicable state, but aristocracy in the abstract is better, and monarchy is still superior on grounds of efficiency. You can more efficiently do good things if you are doing them yourself. He then makes an interesting point about democracy. He says, democracy is to be preferred to tyranny on grounds of inefficiency. Misrule by the many is less effectively evil than one man misrule. And all what is notable is the extreme matter-of-factness of the discussion. He's just weighing it very practically.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. He kind of makes a distinction there between him and Aristotle. Aristotle viewed democracy as the worst, but I guess Aquinas kind of views it as the least bad of the worst systems of government. Like it's superior. It's to be preferred to tyranny just because it's harder for a democracy to do bad things because it's so ineffective.
Yeah.
And a tyranny is worse than that because they're very effective.
Yeah, and I think part of that is because he didn't experience it.
Yeah,
he had no knowledge of it, and he thought, well, it'd take him a while to agree. We can come to a group of us can come to a really bad decision within minutes.
It says that the state is natural in the sense that it suits humanity to organize itself in this fashion, and there are genuine goods that political organization shelters and encourages, and virtues that are required for and elicited by living the political life. So it does some good stuff. It's natural that we do it this way, but it's also unnatural in that mankind would not have lived in the political community in the absence of the fall. He says Adam possessed something similar to property in the use of creation and something like political authority in the authority of a father over his wife and children, but coercive law would not have been needed and would not have existed. So in this perfect natural state, we would not have political systems, which I think, makes sense, but
I guess.
Yeah.
Who knows?
He then goes on to talk about the varieties of law, a very taxonomical?
I don't know. I think you just made that
taxonymic, maybe? Relating to taxonomy. But he describes these varieties of law. And the first one, the highest, is this eternal law, the principles inherent in God's plans for the universe. And kind of along with that, we have natural law, which is something that only humans can follow because it requires reason to discern it. Non-rational animals are guided or governed by natural law, but law is not in them. They cannot follow it as we can. And what natural law is kind of the innate desire to seek good and eschew evil, or alternatively some variant of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so he says that then we have these divine positive laws, which are laws directly given by God to Jews and Christians in a more direct way. We see that in the old law of the Old Testament and the new law given to Christians in the New Testament. And he says that, even though there's kind of a distinction made, they are still one system of law. They are given by one God. It was partially given in the Old Testament and fully given in the New Testament. And Alan Ryan makes the point that relates kind of to modern judicial systems, and like it's not, one person making all of the laws, but it's all part of the same legal system. The court rulings and stuff like that all build upon one another.
Right.
He says there is an indispensable role for human law in the fallen world. It is useful to institute human law to supplement the other laws by which we are governed. The purpose of human law is to make men behave virtuously, not merely to organize relations with each other. He says coercive law is good for repressing antisocial and wicked behavior.
Yeah, and you said this, but I want to quote him because I think this is a really important concept. The purpose of human law is to make men behave virtuously, not merely to organize their relations with one another in a tidy fashion. It's not just about organization. And I don't believe this 100%, but I think we need to refocus some of it on this. That one of the purposes of having a legal system and a political system is to maybe not make, but encourage men and women to behave virtuously, rather than just organizing everybody in the most efficient way possible. And that there's a difference there, and it's an important distinction which we aren't making currently. And I think we're seeing, certainly on the conservative side, a push to have that incorporated. Like you see that in Viktor Orban's Hungary. Now this is more overtly Christian political philosophy, where they're encouraging certain types of moral behavior and discouraging other types of immoral behavior by criminalizing some things that
you think you see that with
decriminalized in the recent decades.
You see that with like Josh Hammer too. I've been looking into a lot of his stuff recently, but kind of the idea that the left is putting their morals into politics. When is it time for the right to put their morals in politics as well?
Yeah, because they don't call it morality or religion, but that's what it is. And you're right. Josh Hammer is one of the leading youngish thinkers on that subject, and it's a big thing percolating up, because it's like, wait a second, if they're going to say we're horrible people because we call a dude he when he's wearing a dress, then maybe we need to start talking about the morality of a dude not wearing a dress and not going in a girl's locker room. Maybe we should start talking about those people in terms of sin and evil and lack of virtue. Because if they're going to call us sinners, in a manner of speaking, why don't we tell them the truth that they are the sinners?
Yeah.
And not be apologetic about it, and say, we're gonna outlaw this stuff because we think it's morally wrong, and because they're trying to outlaw what we say because they think it's morally wrong. They can't justify it intellectually. So that's a big push. It's important. It's interesting that Aquinas hit on this, that long ago, about the purpose of the government is to make people more virtuous, and I think we're going to see a bigger push on that in the next couple of years.
Interesting. He then goes on to say that laws lose authority by being unjust, and when they cease to, serve the purpose for which they were properly made. He says, by nature, there is no private property, but because of our sinful nature now, there needs to be rules for what's mine and what's yours. We should aim to have enough, not as much as possible. And so that gets into his discussion on private property.
There's two main reasons when laws are lose their authority. One is that they're unjust, and second is when they don't serve the purpose that they were made for.
Yes.
And boy, that hits home now. I mean, there's so many laws. It's like, why is that still in the books?
Yeah.
The purpose isn't served anymore. Like the COVID-19 declaration, the purpose of that was to deal with a certain to expedite facilitate the response to COVID-19, and that same law is now being used by Joe Biden for the student loan forgiveness program. What the hell did that one thing have to do with the other?
Yeah.
Doesn't. So it's outlived its purposefulness. He just extended the emergency declaration 90 days. Yeah. Well, it's outlived its purpose. There's no purpose to that, and so it's lost its legitimacy. Now we have to have a process to get rid of it.
It reminds me of kind of like pulling the quote unquote right to abortion out of the right to privacy in the Bill of Rights. And it's like, what does that have to do with one and the other? It's like, you've completely, I'm not saying we should get rid of the right to privacy in the same way that we should get rid of like the COVID emergency procedures, but it's still like, this law is unjust because it's pulling something out of, what was not its intended purpose.
Well, there is no explicit right to privacy in the Constitution. Yes. So that was just a complete fabrication and a creation by some left-wingers that wanted to make sure they can kill babies.
That's a good point.
And it was kept in place because a lot of left-wingers want to keep killing the babies. And now they're really upset because now it's going to be harder, but not impossible. It'll be harder for them to keep killing babies. And boy, they want to kill those babies. But yeah, I understand your point. It's a valid point, but that's it's kind of I think it's a little bit different than outliving its purposefulness. That was just a complete creation.
That is true.
But it's like the what was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was created to get electricity out to the rural areas of the Tennessee Valley. I think that's still in the books, and it's still funding different programs and employees. And it's like, okay, why is that in existence now? I mean, electricity there's electricity everywhere across the United States. Yeah. So there's a lot of those Depression era laws and agencies that were created for that particular purpose. It's like the March of Dimes was created to, what was that for initially? And they expanded it to now all childhood illnesses. But they
Is it polio?
Might have been polio. And it's been I think you're right. But I just remember whatever the original purpose was, they've solved it. Yeah. But it keeps going on. It's like, why don't you just disband, start a new organization? Because it had so many donors and such a good reputation, it just keeps going. Yeah. But,
Interesting. We then get into the virtues of private property, and I thought this was a really interesting discussion where he's talking about the good things about private property. And he makes the distinction first that unlike the Franciscans, the Dominicans claimed that the order did in fact own their belongings, and they did not just use what the Pope allowed. So kind of, again, going back to like the feudal idea of, we just use what is the property of those above us.
Yeah, the Franciscans just had that as a expediency to say we're still living in poverty, but we have these huge estates. But, we don't own it. The Pope is letting us use it.
He's just letting us. It's the Pope's. It's not mine.
What's the difference?
We're just house sitting.
You're still, drinking out of a gold chalice, drinking water out of it, for lunch.
He then says that God gave the world to mankind to use and improve, and gave dominion over inferior creatures. And so this leads to the right to appropriate whatever in the external world is useful for human life. We've talked about that before, and that the world kind of exists, for humanity to use. He says, individual private property is more efficient than other kinds of property because people care more for their own and know which things are their responsibility to care for. So it leads to more care for our actual belongings. But he does say that equitable distribution of property among individuals, so each is content with his own, makes for peace. He says dissension is more common where property is held in common. So not the idea that we should all own, collectively everything, but the idea that kind of we should proportion everything we own relative so that we are all, at a good comfort level with what we do have.
Yes, and if it's disproportionate with some people having so much more than others, it's not practical.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing that like with the claims about the 1% and all that kind of stuff over the last couple of decades.
Yeah,
a lot of envy.
Mm-hmm.
It creates problems, even though the bottom in America are more wealthy than most of the world.
Yeah.
It's that disparity that can cause problems within society, practically speaking.
Yeah. He does defend somewhat of an idea of common use as charity. He says the law aims at the common good, and property depends on law, so distribution of property should serve the common good. A man can use his property so long as he is ready to share with others in times of need. Denying others the means of subsistence invalidates ownership. He says theft is self-evidently wrong, but the rich man's superfluity belongs to the starving man, and he commits no theft in taking what is his by right of necessity.
It's kind of funny he has to explicitly state that. That if you're starving and the only food that is available to you and your family is being stored by the rich guy who doesn't even need it, then there has to be a moral and legal defense of necessity under those circumstances, and it seems pretty apparent. And then he describes it as it is now belonging to the starving people. And I think that's a good way to put it because it's really a possessory interest as opposed to ownership. But I guess it isn't. They don't own it. They can only have it to consume it, so that until they're not starving. I would think.
I'm going to read from the book here because I like the way that he phrases it. He says, the poor can be required to abstain from taking what they need from the stores of the rich, only if the security of the possessions of the better off is essential to the welfare of the poor themselves. St. Basil had said that the rich man was like a man who comes into the theater and takes a seat, and thus ensures that there is no seat for the next comer. If St. Basil was wrong, it must be because the possessions of the rich do not prevent the poor from acquiring possessions of their own, and the wealth of the rich ensures that the poor can thrive.
Correct.
So kind of this idea that you don't have to take from the rich if there is a system in place that gets you what you need already. But if there is no system for that, then you can go ahead and take it.
Right, and Basil is wrong. It's the analogy is the rising tide lifts all ships. So it lifts the little rowboat the same height as it lifts the yacht. And if you look at economics as everybody can go up, but some go up more or they're bigger, then it's not as big of a problem to have a disparity in income and wealth as long as everybody's going up. The problem is if the water dries up and you don't have water, then the guy that has it stored is going to have to share because people are going to die otherwise. But it's an extreme example.
Yeah. He says that, like, for example, in times of famine, poor are entitled to help themselves if nobody helps them. So if there's not a system in place, like I said, then they can take what is theirs.
Right.
And then we move on to a pretty short discussion of war because he pretty much just follows Augustine's account of just war. Must be official, declared by a person or persons authorized to do it. The causes of war must be just, should only be fought in self-defense, which includes preemptive strikes to prevent imminent attack and to recover territory unjustly seized and not returned. And thirdly, that war must be fought with the right intentions, with the aim of restoring peace and punishing the wicked. And then he does argue against the active participation of priests and bishops on the battlefield, which is weird that he had to argue against that in the first place, because it was common practice for bishops, because they had that secular power. It was common for them to lead a feudal host into a battle itself, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah, well, they're so intertwined with the government and really corrupted by all that, they would have their own armies.
Yes.
They'd be out there hacking enough people to death. Turn the other cheek. I'm going to stab it.
He then goes into a very long discussion here about the state and Christianity and what the role is with religion and the state. And this is kind of his big thing, his biggest point here. He did not advocate religious tolerance. He says that the Christian state can bring citizens to as much understanding of the truths of Christian religion as possible. It could promote true religion by ensuring the church is safeguarded and by following the guidance of the church on moral matters. But he does not repudiate the papacy's claims of immunity for clergy in criminal courts, or that church property can only be taxed with church's consent. But he also does not suggest that the Pope has any secular authority outside the papal states. So he kind of takes a middle road there. The Pope doesn't have too much authority, but he does have some authority over churches and things like that.
I kind of thought he was somewhat tolerant, though. I mean, you said
to a degree,
yeah,
and we'll get into that in a little bit. Right. One interesting point was that he claimed that the church has secular authority over the Jews, but the church's authority is not in competition with the states. The Pope can only legitimately intervene in politics when a significant moral issue arises. But he had interesting thoughts about the Jewish people.
Well, I never had, and I'm just ignorant of it, I'd never heard of a canon precept or canon law that the Jews are de facto slaves.
And that's what he's drawing on.
Yeah, and I just had never even heard that before. Which helps explain some of the bad treatment of the Jews in church history. But yeah, that his views, and I'm just gonna get into it now. I guess that they kind of like they're dummies. But they can be used as an example of what the predecessors of Christianity believed and practiced, because it's almost like they're in a zoo. Well, use them as an example of what not to do, because they're too stupid to realize that Jesus is the Savior, and so it's interesting. And then the discussion, that letter about the question about taxation of the Jews, and I liked his answer in a way, because he says, well, I think if I remember correctly from the book. They're slaves, so they can't really possess anything. But he also talks about the usury aspect of it, because he was against usury,
he says first that you could take all of it except a bare subsistence, and then she brings up the point about what if they got it all from usury and stuff. He says, well, you could take that, but it's not for you. It's not for tax purposes. You could distribute it as charity. That's what you should do with it.
That's the brilliant response to it. I'm sure that's not what she wanted to hear, because it's a lot of work. You got to find out, okay, who's charged the interest, and you got to refund it, because it's not yours.
Yeah.
If you're using that as a moral justification to seize somebody's assets because they got it, ill-gotten gains, you can't keep it. You got to either find who paid it and give it back to them, or give it to charity. I mean, it's great. It's a brilliant way to thread the needle to stop somebody from stealing from the Jews.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, I mean, it's like, if somebody robs a bank and then I just rob all of their money because, they took it illegally, now it's mine. And it's like, well, shouldn't you give it back to the people who actually own it?
Right.
You can't just take it for yourself.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's the big problem. I'm getting a little far afield with government seizure of drug money, because they keep it, they seize it, and it's a civil proceeding. It's easy to keep. And then they buy equipment for their own department, or they fund their own department. They can even give themselves raises if it's enough money, and it's really corrupting.
Yeah.
So there's been some reforms on it, but it's not enough. But similar type thing. It's like, well, how do you? But their argument is, we're not using it on us. We're using it to improve the community by funding law enforcement. Yeah. Okay, well, six one way, half a dozen the other.
He then goes back to what we were talking about. He says that he did not argue for a strict divide of the church and state. He says the 13th century view was that there are distinguishable jurisdictions, but they are interlinked and overlapping. So they do have somewhat unique roles, but the roles kind of combine in certain ways. He then says, I'm going to read from the book, this idea of different jobs. He says, things go better when everyone sticks to one job. The takeover of secular functions by the church made no more sense than monarchs setting themselves up as theological authorities. Neither did a sharp line of separation between the spheres of authority of church and state. Kings should rule with the moral guidance of the church. The church should look to the salvation of souls with the earthly assistance of the state. So do your own job, but help each other out. It's essentially the bottom line.
Yeah, and it's an interesting. I think it's a concept that's going to come back. Of the state working cooperatively with the church, or a Christian philosophy to influence its decisions on passing laws and administering the secular side. It used to be more so, but whatever. I won't go on that tangent again.
He then says that earthly rulers are to be obeyed when they perform the functions that earthly rulers are supposed to perform. When they do not, we should not resort to extra legal activities unless they will do more good than harm.
Yeah.
So you can overthrow them if it'll do more good than harm. He says, if a ruler demands an action explicitly forbidden by Christian teaching, then he has forfeited his right to have us obey. We return to a state of nature in which we can legitimately do whatever is morally acceptable to restore a stable, lawful, and unoppressive regime, which is interesting.
It would be hard to calculate the cost-benefit analysis of a revolution because everything gets out of your control.
Yeah.
I love the discussion of heretics, which is completely weird to us because nobody even talks about these things anymore.
Yeah,
although the Catholic Church should, because there's a bunch of priests that are basically heretics.
Yeah.
Talking to you Jesuits.
He says, first of all, that there are many arguments against compelling unbelievers to adopt the faith. He says faith is something we must come to willingly. We should certainly stop unbelievers from subverting the faith of Christians, and a ruler may limit a minority of non-believers' freedom of speech to avoid unsettling the faith of the majority. He says, killing the infidel is not good, but mild coercion is effective. Savage persecution arouses resistance, but coercion does not. But then he says that, heretics are not just unbelievers. They are in breach of obligations freely made and must be forced to meet them. The heretic has committed mortal sin and condemned himself to eternal death. So summary execution is warranted, but the church does not usually do so out of mercy or until the heretic has had several chances to repent.
It's very similar to my understanding of the theory of in Islam. It's one thing to be a Christian from the beginning or a Jew from the beginning. It's another thing to have been a Muslim and then convert. And I think the punishment for that is death. Very similar arguments.
Yeah. He goes on to say that a heretic ruler can be deposed for apostasy, and the Pope has the right to excommunicate him, and an excommunicated ruler has no authority. But yeah, it's an interesting distinction he makes. Like you're saying, it's not just somebody, an atheist, is fine. They can do whatever they want.
I think they would have problems with atheists.
Well, maybe.
I think because atheism would not have been acceptable.
Yeah.
I think.
That would probably be heresy. That would be heresy, I would assume.
Not really, because you're not
if they're not a Christian. Yeah.
You're not saying that the Christian religion is X. You're not a heretic. I think is somebody who's giving false witness with regard to the faith. Like a Jew has their own faith, a Muslim has their own faith, an atheist. I think the atheists would have been executed. And I think that's just a given in this society. It's probably why it isn't even addressed. True. Because that is just abhorrent. As opposed to like maybe an agnostic, which is really just a non-practicing non-believer. But I don't know that for sure. But I'm suspecting that's why we don't have discussion. A heretic is different than an atheist, I think. Probably. Although an atheist who used to be a Christian could be considered a heretic.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes. And then going on to the last discussion here about politeia, kingship, and tyranny. He defends a moderate monarchy. He says the polity exists for peace and for unity and is best ruled by a king, and that the unity of the larger is mirrored by the unity of the smaller. So such if you have one king united with himself, that'll mirror unity of a larger kingdom. He says the authority of the king is the authority of the political community. The wise king governs with the advice and consent of his nobles in conformity with the church. He says it is not the personal will of the king that makes his laws, but his representative will. If the ruler is the source of disunity and scandal, his title to govern is undermined. So it's not just whatever the king says goes. One man misrule or tyranny is the worst form of government. If tyrants can't be gotten rid of, they should be. If tyrants can be gotten rid of, they should be. An enduring tyrannical rule is defensible only when attempting overthrow will create worse evils. Essentially saying, you have a duty and an obligation to overthrow a tyrant unless it'll bring about, worse actions. He says, since the king's authority rests on the consensus of the community, his removal must be an act of community, not an act of the individual. And so an individual does so by an appeal to heaven on behalf of a whole political community. And that's how you would go about deposing a king.
By the grace of God, I kill thee.
Exactly, yes. But that was the end of the chapter on Aquinas. What did you think of all of his thoughts?
I was going to ask you first.
You're going to ask me first?
Yeah, what do you think of Aquinas' theories of politics, the role of church and state? I've said a lot, but you haven't said anything of your own views.
I mean, I don't think a lot of it is very new, if that makes sense. Like, I mean, he's presenting a new spin on things, but he's incorporating a lot of the old that we've already seen, is what I really think. And that's a big accomplishment for him, especially considering the state of pagan philosophy and stuff in the Christian world. But I feel like, we're not breaching terribly new ground. He has some new ideas and new spins on things, but it's still the same questions, it's still the same problems, and they're answered in somewhat similar ways to what we've seen already.
I don't know that I agree with that.
You don't know if you agree?
Yeah, because he's significantly different, especially in an emphasis with regard to from Augustine about the fallen nature of man and the role of the government vis-a-vis the citizen. That the citizen should just passively comply because it's hell on earth anyway. What does it matter? The type of philosophy from Saint Augustine, but he's also different from Aristotle because he injects the Christianity as a fundamental basis for the government and just laws. That there has to be this morality, and that there is there's a natural law that's not just empirical, that has to be some sort of grace inspired system, a Christian system. So I think in a way I would agree with you, but I also would disagree that it's almost revolutionary how he weaved those different philosophers together in a very very practical way, in a practical philosophical way, which is really hard to do.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely coming around to the idea of like morals in the government, because I used to be very much opposed to them. Like there should be no room for morals in the government. It should be just strictly organizational type stuff. But I've been looking at it, and it's like, when has there ever been no morals in the government? Correct. When has the government acted purely based on like practicality and organization stuff? That's never happened.
Right.
And I'm coming around. I guess it's kind of like the national conservative movement is kind of what it's being called now. But I definitely am leaning more in favor of that over time, especially in the crazy world that we live in right now. I don't know how best. I mean, this is kind of just my political thoughts, but I don't know how best to like implement that. I'm still very wary of like explicitly saying, the government has the right to enforce certain values, because then it's like, well, the government likes to skew things to its own desires.
Yeah, and I share that. That's exactly where I'm coming from too. But my thought was, well, we need to get that kind of religious aspect out of our laws, and to a large extent we have. But like you said, there's never been a non-moral legal system.
We just like to be more covert about it.
Really.
Or less explicit.
Yeah, less explicit and really dishonest about it. And so really what we've done is we've ceded the traditional Judeo-Christian values from the contemplating passing laws and enforcement of laws, especially in the criminal justice arena, and we replaced it with this different morality, which is less effective, mostly because it's not articulated as a system.
Yeah,
it's not because it's not within a religious context. You don't have they're contradictory. In many respects, because they aren't thought out as a system like a religion is. And so Catholicism or any Christianity has to wrestle with as a system the principles of justice and turning the other cheek, with the practical considerations of how do we administer the society so that we discourage people from killing each other, and we punish people who do, and we have to protect society. Otherwise, we end up in a state of nature, which is anarchy and murder.
Yeah. Well, what do you think kind of is like the underlying moral principle in government right now, if there is one, if you can sum up?
There isn't. It's completely contradictory, and it's this lack of awareness, especially on the criminal side, of, okay, what's the purpose? Nobody even thinks about, and nobody's writing about, why do we have a criminal justice system?
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental problem right now, is that Americans forgot why we have a criminal justice system. We just don't even talk about it. We talk, and then the practical side of it is all screwed up. Like, for instance, the cash bail thing, because the argument is a good argument for meaning that you can't require people to post cash for something while the charges are pending. So you just get released on a promise to show up in court. And what that, and the reason for that is that, well, they aren't found guilty of anything yet, and they have to have their day in court. So why should you have a rich person go free because they can post a $50,000 cash bond and deposit with the court, and they're out the next day, as opposed to the poor person who doesn't have $50,000, but it's the same crime. The problem is, well, nobody wants to lose $50,000.
Yeah.
And so you put conditions on bond that you're not committing any new offenses, et cetera, et cetera. And even the rich person who violates those terms is going to be in with no bond. back in with no bond. But the other side of it is our criminal justice system is so, they say, sclerotic. It's so scarred and so inefficient that it takes a year to get these cases resolved. In the olden days, it wouldn't have been a big deal to let somebody out pending a trial, because a trial would be next month.
Yeah.
And it's a relatively short period of time, and maybe they can mind their P's and Q's for a month. And then then they're being trial. And if they're guilty, they're going to prison, or they're being executed, almost summarily. Like horse thieves hung and stuff like that. I mean, it might be an appeal, but it's going to be short lived, one way or the other. It's going to be decided pretty quickly. But you combine the fact that you can't get any sort of quick resolution of these charges with letting people out with no conditions on them. It's just created this complete crazy nightmare scenario where people just keep going. It's literally a revolving door, in and immediately processed out. Where cuffs are on them for maybe an hour.
Yeah.
So, but so people have forgotten. Okay, why do we even make these things crimes? And you've seen the decriminalization movement for misdemeanor theft. Or theft up to a certain value. That's why California's all these stores are closing, because they said, we're decriminalizing theft under $750. It's going to be a fine at most. Yeah. Well, these people don't have any money to fine. So you fine them, then what? How do you collect on it? Well, you can't put them in jail for not paying a fine just because they're poor. You can't put people in jail just because they're poor, because that's what you're doing at that point, because there's not a jail sentence. So they don't pay their fine. You can't punish them for not paying their fine. There's literally no consequence. So they can just go into a store, and as long as they're under a certain limit, they can steal whatever they want. Yeah. And there's no punishment. And so you have to get back to, okay, wait a second. Why is it wrong to steal from Walgreens? This is maybe a multinational corporation, billions and billions in assets. Why is it wrong for me to steal a candy bar from Walgreens? They have it. They have hundreds of candy bars there. Why am I prohibited from taking that candy bar? And it has to be a moral system. Yeah. That is wrong to steal. I have no right to it, and it is immoral for me to take it from them. And then there's the collateral consequences, practical consequences. But at its heart, a criminal justice system is a moral system. Yeah. And we aren't recognizing that.
Well, kind of to go back to like Augustine's idea, like especially going on with like the misdemeanor theft and stuff like that, because Augustine's idea is, of course, when we become afraid of the law, we're no longer afraid of each other. But now, these criminals with the misdemeanor theft aren't afraid of the law, and they aren't afraid of the person, working at the front desk of the store. Because especially, the person, if they try to stop them, they're more likely to be punished than the criminal is.
That's right.
I mean, even if not in the legal system, they'll probably be fired.
They will absolutely be fired.
I mean, that's what I was told the whole time working at Lowe's over the summer. You do not try to stop somebody. Right. You will be fired on the spot, because that is just more danger than it's worth.
Right. Well, and it makes sense from an employer's perspective, because you don't want your employees to risk their life for the employer's property. Yeah. Let it go. It's not your stuff. And so that makes a lot of sense, but practically speaking, it just means it's a free-for-all. And then it's just game on, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's crazy. But I think there's an over-moralizing about a lot of stuff. I'll give you examples of those. Over-moralizing with regard to the transgender stuff, the LGBT stuff, that they are divine creatures that cannot be, I'm not kidding, that they are divine creatures that cannot be criticized by anybody. There's a hierarchy of rights and privileges, but it's starting to be put into code, into our laws, that this divine right to be a transgender or gay or whatever they want to call themselves today, but without really thinking through the morality of all that. Why does it make them better? Why are they morally superior? And they will not have an answer for that. There is no moral superiority for somebody who is transgendered. Yeah. Even the most favorable view of them is just that they are the way they are. And they're just insisting people recognize the way they are.
I think that's part of the moralizing. It's like they are being their true self. Who are you to deny their true self? I think is really what it is. It's they've taken that brave step to be who they really are. I think is kind of underlying moral aspect there.
Yeah, but what's moral about that? What's good about that? It's just, it is what it is.
Well,
They're doing that. I'm being my true self of being a bigot. You know, they don't, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If my true self is to be a bigot, I'm not saying I'm a bigot, but if that's what my true self is, why is that less value than their value?
Well, it kind of goes back to...
They don't consider, okay, how do I articulate the morality of our superiority?
I've kind of thought about this in terms of like, you know, diversity and stuff like that. Like, I don't think there's inherently anything good about diversity, but there's also nothing inherently bad about it. It's like, you know, because they think, you know, it is inherently good if we have more black people here. And it's like, well, why?
Right.
Like, you just have more black people here. Congratulations. Like, what does that accomplish?
Because,
what is moral about that?
Because they're morally superior. A group that is racially diverse is morally superior to a group that is racially homogenous, white.
Yeah.
A group that is racially homogenous of color is of equal value morally to a heterogeneous, diverse group. But a homogeneous white community is morally lesser because it is just white people. And they are making that moral judgment every day, explicitly, but they aren't articulating why.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify, I don't think we should, you know, not have diversity. Like, we should not limit diversity, but we also shouldn't like actively, you know,
correct,
go for it. I think it's wrong both ways. If it happens, it happens, but if it doesn't, it doesn't.
Well, and that's the I mean, it's a whole argument about affirmative action or those quotas, and it's going up the Supreme Court, and the liberals are going to lose their minds when that gets held unconstitutional because it's unconstitutional to discriminate
literally
against somebody
judging based on skin color,
and they're discriminating primarily against Asians because if they didn't, just by the test scores and other factors, Harvard would be like 50% Asian, and they don't want a whole bunch of Asians.
Well, that's what
they want enough Asians because a lot of them, you know, pay full tuition, and they can make money off of it.
That's what my roommate tells me sometimes because his mom is Vietnamese. She's from Vietnam, so he's half Vietnamese. But we have like a McNair scholars program at Truman, which is like for minority groups and stuff, and they just get extra money essentially if you become a McNair scholar. And it's like I can't apply for that. I'm not considered. And it's like, what? Your mom is literally from, you know, she fled Vietnam when it was very much a communist country.
Right.
And it's like, well, this doesn't make any sense. You're very much still a minority in this country. It's crazy.
Yeah, and they don't think about those things. And if there's a premise to those programs, and the premise is that the minority students cannot compete on an equal footing. That is the premise of all of it, and they will never acknowledge it. But that's what they are saying with their policies. And but they will say this. They will say because of the stuff the white people have done have kept them down, and now we're just trying to even the field. But I don't know why more. I mean, you're seeing it more and more, but there's not enough of it. Why more people in the African American community don't consider that a complete total insult?
Yeah, it's just
if you had a scholarship that only said that only was for white people, I'd be like, F you. I'm not applying for that.
Yeah.
F you. I don't need your stupid racist money. And until the recipients of these programs make that moral judgment that it's offensive to take the money, it's going to stay. You know, and it makes... Because really the people that are creating it are liberal white women, and they're racist. Yeah. I think the most racist group, and I'm going to make this generalization, the most racist group in the country, the entire country, by far, are liberal white women. And I don't think anybody who's really looked at it would disagree with that. Yeah.
I mean, they're
horrible people.
That's the whole thing with like the Latinx idea.
Yeah, forcing a false word on a community that doesn't want it. Yeah. And I think they're all racist. I think on some level they acknowledge that they're all racist because they're scared of people of color, and they're trying to atone for their own guilt. It's their indulgences, you know, but they're not paying the indulgences. They're just facilitating the payment of indulgences by our tax money, by other people's money to say, I'm a good person because I'm giving scholarships only to black people. I'm giving job opportunities only to black people. And of course it devalues black people or other people of color. It also calls into question the people of color that have made it on merit alone. And then also, if you have a whole bunch of people that haven't earned it, meaning haven't done the hard work and don't have the, quite frankly, intellectual capacity to operate at the highest level, but you throw them in at the highest level competing against the Asians and the whites who had to overcome the diversity stuff, you see dropout rates. They're crazy. And what message does that send to the whites and the Asians that are able to be successful? And they see a bunch of African Americans come in and they're like, these people can't even do it. And it makes those people more susceptible to making a generalization about African Americans, because this group of African Americans who they don't know who's scholarship or not. They don't know who's gotten an accommodation on their lower test scores and lower grades to get into that school or not. And so, you may have, you just have higher dropout rates. You have higher failure rates. And if you don't know, if you knew, okay, well, this person shouldn't have been here anyway, they got a special deal, well, then you're not going to think differently of a group. But if 25% of that group don't make it, you start thinking, I mean, just naturally, you're going to have that impression. Well, why in the hell can't, why do they have such a high dropout? Why did they have a high dropout rate? You're treating them you're thinking of them as a group now, where you wouldn't have otherwise, because if you just had the people that earned it, that could do the high test scores, that did all the work leading up to it, and you're all on equal footing, you're going to have the same dropout rates in any category. Yeah. Because you're all, you're going to have dropouts that'll, maybe people have emotional breakdowns, or maybe a family member dies, or maybe they use drugs, or they party too much, or whatever. You're going to have that across the board for people that earned it. And so it's a huge, huge problem, huge problem in our society. And it will only be solved now. I mean, what the Supreme Court's going to do us all a favor this year. I predicted they're going to outlaw it. And they're going to say there is going to be, you cannot even know the race of anybody applying for college or for a job or anything else. And we're going to treat everybody equally. And maybe, you can advertise. The affirmative action originally was, you need to make an effort to take affirmative action to recruit these people. That was what it originally was, but pre-quota. And that's what it was sold as. And it makes a lot of sense because, Harvard wouldn't, there was I don't know if it still exists, but there was a African-American, I have air quotes, African-American newspaper called the St. Louis American. And it was marketed and distributed primarily in the African-American community about African-American leaders and business leaders and politicians and all that. Well, the affirmative action would say, we need to get an ad in that paper. So there's a bunch of smart black kids that are reading this paper. They're going to apply to our school. We want to get out there so they know we exist and they're welcome. That's what affirmative action was supposed to be. And that's what it should be. We should let everybody know if they can do the work, they're welcome in a public university. And that's not what's happening. And you see it. I mean, I saw it at every college tour. And I know it drives your mother crazy, but you notice the lack of lack of Caucasian males in advertisements.
Yes, I was about to mention that. That's a thing, especially at Truman.
We're a huge percentage of the population.
Overwhelmingly white, 70% or higher, for sure.
Right, for sure.
But that if you pick up any Truman Today newsletter, you look at anything that the university officially puts out, and it is 20, 25% white people, in any picture, in any given picture.
Correct.
And it's where do you find these people? I walk around campus and it's majority white people. It's it's very, very clearly we need to find somebody to fill this slot on this newspaper. And it's that's not the way it should be. Yeah,
and it sends a terrible message to everybody because the people of a color that are chosen to participate are chosen because of their skin, and then the white people are excluded. It's I get it if every paper came out and it's just white people. I get it. You don't want to exclude it, and you probably should take an effort to make sure you include everybody. But when you see ads that are always, the universities are terrible about it, and all the inclusiveness stuff from minute one before you're even on the campus, every single college introductory program, tour, pamphlet always talks about inclusivity of all these other sexual stuff. Well, we went on that tour of Xavier, which is a Catholic university, and they just walked us past the church that was in the center of the campus of a college. I had to request to go into
St. Xavier University. That's what it is.
A Catholic university. They were completely oh yeah, it's Catholic. Are you Catholic? They had to check with, are you Catholic? Yeah, we're Catholic. He went to St. Pius X High School. And I don't know if you put that on the information for the tour, but my God, at a Catholic university, they should feel comfortable saying, "Hey, are you Catholic? It's a Catholic university. A lot of extra Catholic stuff here. They got a priest that hangs out on campus. You know, the rally priest or whatever the hell they call them." Anyway, that's a long rant.
Yeah, that was a long rant. That took up like 20 minutes.
But it gets back to the moral system. They don't have an articulable system. They have feelings about this issue, feelings about that issue, feelings about this issue. And they're all contradictory. So like the bail reform is causing the death, literally directly causing the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands of African Americans across this country today. There's going to be somebody murdered today by a person that is released on a no bond on a case that 3 years ago would have been kept in custody, and that person would have been a known danger. And they are coming to Festus, Missouri. Yeah. They're going back home in those communities, and they're killing young black kids. And it's horrible. It's offensive. But if you say that, you're
racist.
But at this point, we're getting Republican leaders that don't give a rat's ass. You know, you can only call us racist so many times, and then it's completely diluted. Yeah. You know, it's watered down. Okay, whatever. You know, yawn. Tell me something I care about, because I don't care about. And you're seeing more Republican leaders, and I think Trump was the forefront of that. He was a lightning rod. They're calling him a racist. Where do they get that from? Yeah. He was never considered a racist. Never. I mean, never, ever, until he was squawking about Obama's birth certificate. And then a bunch of people were going after him about that. But, you know, Obama had a weird history. He was in Hawaii. Yeah. He lived in Singapore. He was Barry Soweto, Sotaro or whatever. He had an Indian last name, and his first name was Barry, and he lived in Pakistan. He always calls it Pakistan for years. Does anybody know that? You didn't know that, did you?
I didn't know that. No, I did not.
Yeah, he was raised by his father was Indonesian. No, he was black. I'm sorry, he was Kenyan. But his stepfather was Indonesian. His mother took him to Indonesia, and that's where he got the different last name. It's a Muslim country, and so there were interesting questions about his history.
Interesting.
And in Trump's standard fashion was to do it ham-handedly, saying, "Show me the birth certificate." And of course, Obama loved to have that issue live, so he didn't. He could have just authorized the release of it immediately, and he didn't for whatever reason. Because it's, you know, his record, he could have just produced a certified copy of it immediately the next day, but he didn't for whatever reason. And so there's this backstory back there. Anyway, so that was the only thing they thought was racist, but he was just going after Obama. Obama hated him. He hated Obama. And then after that, I mean, he got awards from like the NAACP. You know, he was pounding around with what's his face, Jesse Jackson and all those guys. And how all these celebrities on his shows never called a racist for any of that stuff. He was in celebrity culture and politics. He was a Clinton donor, but as soon as he ran for president, and he started talking about immigration and how they're letting a rapist come across the border, which they are. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. The newest reports are that Venezuela is opening their prisons and encouraging people to flow north through Central America and through Mexico, and that's somehow racist. Well, really, when you look at it, the people that extrapolate from him saying that some of them are rapists and criminals to all of them are rapists or criminals are the actual racists. You know, they're the ones saying, well, you were saying all these. No, we're not. He's never said that. You're saying it, and you're acting like he said it. And so, you know, it's completely inconsistent, and it's horrible. And we we ended up doing is we pulled Christianity out of the legal system, and we didn't replace it. And now they're replacing it with their weirdo, crazy values,
contradictory,
and illogical, evil philosophy, denigrating anything that is of value in this country. You see those idiot climate protesters tried to...
they threw a can of soup at a Van Gogh.
Van Gogh. I mean...
well, what I saw was funny is that the soup company, I forget which one it was, but it's like one of the... like if you're, a climate, activist or whatever, it's one of the biggest users of like a certain type of palm oil that is like very detrimental to the ecosystem.
Fantastic.
In like Indonesia
Fantastic.
or something.
Right.
And it's like, well, you just use that soup to
why soup?
Yeah, why soup? It has nothing to do with anything. It's crazy.
Anyway, so I think what we just need to do, and what we're going to do, is we're going to see a real attack, counterattack, and inserting a moral system, an already established moral system back in our code and in our laws, and we're just going to say, they're going to say, oh, you're just doing that because you're Christian. Okay, all right, yeah, fine. Yeah, and if you get back into power, you can do all your crazy shit again. But we're in power now, and so we're going to pass laws that don't discriminate against anybody else, but are consistent with our Christian faith. So pound sand.
Yeah,
quit killing babies. We think killing babies is a bad idea. If you want it, you get in power and you pass a law. We can kill babies all the time. But this is our values, and we're going to do it. We're not going to apologize for it anymore. You're going to see a lot more of that, and when we see a lot more of that, the people are going to be in favor of it because it makes a lot of sense and it lines up with the values of 80% of the public. The transgender stuff is like 10% of the public. Maybe we're talking about castrating children. Whatever. I don't want to go down.
I think we need to wind down the rants here a little bit.
But Aquinas is on the dot with a lot of this stuff, and
I agree.
How many hundreds of years ago?
I agree. Well, you could follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
This has been Unlimited Opinions. Very long rant. That was like a half-hour long.
Well, you participated.
I did participate, so it was a good rant.
I should have got you to talk more.
That was a good one.
That was a good one.